A phrase often used by Bernie Sanders supporters that first emerged in 2016 and continues to be used in 2020 is the phrase Bernie or bust, which just means that you believe that either Bernie Sanders has to win the election or everybody has lost the election, meaning all the people have lost. Is this a fair mindset? Yes. And here's why. These three candidates here, Elizabeth Warren, Andrew Yang, and Tulsi Gabbard, are the only three candidates that I would consider even having a chance of being on par with Bernie, or being able to say, if they win, that's a victory too. It doesn't have to be Bernie. And I want to explain why that's not true. So I want to go through the most important positions for all of these candidates and see who comes out on top for each of them. Let's start with probably the biggest competition of Bernie, which is Elizabeth Warren. Not only is she polling the highest of these three opponents, but she's also often considered the closest to him politically, and she's not as close to him as you'd think. So Medicare for All, Bernie wrote it. It is his brainchild, so he absolutely is winning in that area. Warren for a while kind of was very wishy-washy on Medicare for All, and she still is. She came out with her own Medicare for All plan, but it's not nearly as good as Bernie's because it allows for loopholes to be done that stop the rich from having to pay for this, and it pretty much only ends up making the poor pay more for it, so it's not nearly as good as Bernie's. But regardless, she did come out with a plan, so I'll give her a plus for that, but she also has been very wishy-washy, so she also gets a minus. This is very professional, by the way. College. Elizabeth Warren will forgive up to $50,000 in student debt. Bernie will forgive all of it. So, once again, Bernie is perfect in this area. And then Warren is only 50,000, which is pretty good still. So I'll still give her a plus, but it's not fully forgiving all student loan debt. And she's pretty good about making colleges tuition free though. So I'll give her 2 pluses and a minus. Bernie's still winning in college. Foreign policy. This is where Elizabeth Warren is super weak. She not only voted for the Iraq War, she also supported Trump's military budget increase. Bernie voted against the Iraq War and says we need to lower the military budget and says we need to treat Palestinians as people. I was a critic of him in terms of foreign policy for a long time, but in recent years he has become great at foreign policy, which I'm glad to see. Minimum wage, they're actually on an even playing field here. They both are very good about minimum wage. They both have said they want 15. That's great. I'm glad to see it. Climate change. Warren's kind of quiet about climate change. She seems good, but I'll give her 1 plus because there's nothing bad in terms of climate change for her, but there's just nothing particularly great, whereas Bernie has a great climate change plan. Consistency. Elizabeth Warren was a Republican for a while, and Elizabeth Warren endorsed Hillary Clinton in 2016 when she could have endorsed Bernie, and Elizabeth Warren is notoriously wishy-washy on all of these above policies. She's awful in this area. Bernie has fought for these things for decades now, and is one that has never, ever changed in almost any of his stances, and whenever he does change, it's for the better. He is amazing at this. Revolutionary. Warren considers herself a capitalist, so that's just automatically 3 negatives, and she says she's a capitalist to her bones, in fact, whereas Bernie is the only candidate and only person really in the Senate who will call himself a democratic socialist. He is great here. I don't have to say anything here. Bernie has nothing but pluses, and Warren has pluses and minuses, but Bernie is much better. Andrew Yang. Bernie, once again, we know Bernie's great here. We don't have to talk about him again. Yang, even though he says he supports Medicare for All on his website, he's really come out more for a public option, and he's come out against Medicare for All. So he could be way worse on healthcare, but he's definitely not Medicare for All, so plus and minus. College, once again, we know where Bernie sits here, so we don't have to do anything. Yang doesn't say too much. He supports charter schools, which I know isn't the same thing, but I'm kind of just looking at education as a whole, I guess. And in terms of making colleges tuition free, he really doesn't say that ever. So I'm just going to give him 1 minus. Foreign policy, another thing where Yang's pretty silent, but he's not terrible. He's at least alluded to the fact that he wants to get out of wars, like the Iraq War and, all the drug war and the genocides and the Middle Eastern countries, all that bad stuff. We know what I'm talking about. He wants to get out of all that. So he's at least decent, but he's not Bernie. Gotta make sure he gets 3, because it's Bernie. Minimum wage. Yang is not good here because he has his alternative, UBI, which we'll get to in a minute. And then Bernie, obviously, good. Climate. Another thing where Yang is silent. The problem with Yang really is that he's so caught up in UBI that he fails to address a lot of these other issues very substantively. And what's sad is that he probably is pretty good on a lot of these if he would just talk about them more. But whenever I watch the debates and stuff, he just doesn't mention much of what he's going to do in terms of these plans. But he's talked a little bit about it. He's fine. I'll just plus and minus. Could be way better. Could be way worse. Yep, once again, know where Bernie sits. I promise we're gonna get more interesting with Bernie in a second. Consistency. I'm gonna just exempt Yang from this because Yang's not been really involved in politics outside of this presidential election. So it's not fair for me to judge him on consistency because there's not really much there to judge. So that doesn't really hold much weight for either of them in this particular matchup. Revolutionary. Yang's an entrepreneur. He's a capitalist. I guess he doesn't come out and say he's a capitalist to his bones. So I'll only give him 2 minuses as opposed to Warren's 3. But still not good. for someone like me and for Bernie supporters. Okay, UBI and drug crimes. Now this is where it actually gets interesting. UBI, obviously, this is Yang's signature policy. I like the idea of UBI a lot. This is great. And Bernie does not support UBI. The difference being, I'll even give Bernie 3 negatives because he does not support UBI. The thing is, Bernie and Yang have 2 different mindsets with theoretically the same goal. Bernie, through Medicare for All, through debt forgiveness, through higher minimum wage, says, I'm going to have you make a little bit more money, but mostly I'm going to make you save more of the money that you have right now. Like, he's not going to give you more, but you're going to be able to keep more of what you currently make as opposed to having to give so much of it up on healthcare and on college, student debt, and all that stuff. Whereas Yang says, I'm not going to make college and healthcare more affordable. I'm just going to give you more money to be able to pay for that stuff. And then drug crimes. This is a sad thing for me to do because Bernie does not support decriminalizing drugs. This is what I'm referring to, by the way, is drug decriminalization. Andrew Yang does support decriminalizing all drugs. This is a great stance, and I wish Bernie would take it because it's an awful stance that Bernie should not support this. And I'm really glad that Yang does because he's really the only one that does. So I would say, honestly, based on this, Yang's doing better than Warren in terms of a competition, but Bernie still clearly comes out on top. And Tulsi Gabbard. Medicare for All. Obviously, we know Bernie sits where he sits again. That's all good and well. And then Tulsi's kind of weird on Medicare for All because she really flip-flops, but I've heard her say Medicare for All who want it, which is, Pete Buttigieg, neoliberal centrist talking. I'll give her a plus and a minus because she's not awful, but she really could be way better than she is. I realize now that I misspelled college right here. College. Know where Bernie sits? No, I'm just gonna go ahead and go back through where Bernie sits real quick, and then we'll address Tulsi. That's a great plus. Foreign policy, he's amazing. Minimum wage, he's great. I only gave him one beforehand, but that's okay. I'm a professional. That's a T. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. Now, college. This is another thing where Tulsi's just kind of silent, like kind of similar to Yang. I I want to think that she supports that, but honestly, I couldn't tell you because she's just kind of silent on it. I'm just gonna exempt her because I have no idea. Foreign policy. This is where Tulsi is like supposedly like the god of all of these candidates. She is like the foreign policy candidate. For a while, I actually bought it, like at the beginning of this 2020 election, because Bernie's foreign policy wasn't that good, and Tulsi's was like perfect. These days, Bernie really is on par with Tulsi in terms of foreign policy. They both want to end the wars, although I would argue their motivations for ending it are very different. I can't take anything away from Tulsi's foreign policy, but no longer is she like better than Bernie at it. They're equal. She's great, but so is he. Minimum wage. Another thing that I don't hear her talk about too much, but she has said she wants to raise wages, maybe not necessarily $15 an hour wage. So plus and minus, not as good as Bernie. Climate change. Again, similar to Yang with UBI, Tulsi's all about foreign policy, and it makes it hard for me to discern where you sit on these other issues. But she's, I mean, I'll give her a plus and a minus because she says, like, she's talked about fossil fuel industry and, fossil man bad, but doesn't have a clear laid out plan. Consistency. This is a tough one for me because she endorsed Bernie Sanders in 2016. That's super admirable. Elizabeth Warren didn't do that. Tulsi did. That's great. However, Tulsi does have a record of bad policy. For one, she has a history of anti-LGBT stances. She has come out and apologized for those stances. Yes, she regrets those stances, according to her, whether you believe her or not. But regardless, she is not fully consistent, whereas Bernie Sanders has been fighting for LGBT workers since like the 80s or even the 70s. And she also is wishy-washy on issues, like I said, like Medicare for All. So consistency-wise, she's weird, because in some ways she's super consistent, in other ways she's not. I'm going to give her 2 pluses and a minus, because she's weird. And revolutionary, definitely nowhere near Bernie. Again, kind of like Yang, she doesn't call herself a capitalist to her bones necessarily, but she definitely doesn't consider herself a socialist. So she's definitely nowhere near as revolutionary as Bernie is. So we look at all three of these. There really is no competition now. I mean, don't take my statements just as fact right away. I will cite as many sources as I can, and I'll put them in the description for you to fact check me on the claims I made against these candidates or for these candidates. But if you do your own research even, you will find that nobody is as consistent as Bernie, nobody is as devoted and like has a clearly laid out plan for these policies as Bernie. Nobody really compares to Bernie. Even like Andrew Yang's got his signature policy, sure, but everywhere else he doesn't even compare to Bernie. Elizabeth Warren at best is Bernie light. Nobody comes close to Bernie, even if you don't like Bernie, if you don't like Medicare for All, tuition-free college, you for some reason want to not end the wars, you don't want to raise the wage, whatever it may be. Do not act like these candidates are comparable to Bernie, because they are not. It's Bernie or bust. That's a fair mindset.